Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're taking a closer look at Pseudomonas prevention, specifically how to keep this common bacteria from contaminating, taps and basins, places where you think the water is clean. We'll be diving into a guide by Chris Chalice.
Yeah.
He's a UK expert in antimicrobial fixtures, and he's got over 20 years of experience. A lot of his focus is in healthcare settings.
He's been doing this a long time, so he definitely knows his stuff.
He does. He does. Now, this bacteria, it thrives in moist environments and forms tough biofilms, making it a sneaky threat.
Right, and that's what makes it so difficult to get rid of.
Right. So before we get into all that, what exactly is Pseudomonas aeruginosa?
Well, it's a gram-negative rod-shaped bacterium.
Okay, and why is that a concern,
Yeah.
especially in healthcare?
Well, for one, it's an opportunistic pathogen. It targets people who are already vulnerable, especially those with weaker immune systems.
I see. So people who are already sick are at an even greater risk.
Exactly. And the fact that it can form biofilms makes it even more difficult to treat.
Like we were talking about before, those microscopic fortresses.
Yep. Plus, it can be resistant to antibiotics, which makes it even trickier to get rid of.
So not only is it difficult to kill, but it's also becoming more and more resistant to the things we used to kill it.
That's the problem. It can adapt and survive.
We've got this resilient bacteria lurking where we least expect it. What are the potential consequences if we don't take steps to prevent it?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is back contamination.
Back contamination. What exactly does that mean?
So imagine you're rinsing something contaminated in a basin. Even if you clean it thoroughly, Pseudomonas can still be hiding in the pipes.
Still in the pipes.
Yeah. And then the next time you use the tap, it can get back into the water supply. That's back contamination. And it's a serious issue, especially in healthcare settings where people are already vulnerable.
That's a scary thought. So it's not just about cleaning surfaces. We need to think about the entire system.
Exactly. And the consequences can be pretty serious. Hard to treat infections, outbreaks, you name it.
It's not good. Okay, so what strategies are typically used to prevent this kind of contamination?
Well, there are a few traditional methods. Chemical disinfection is one.
Okay, so using things like chlorine or ozone to kill the bacteria sounds pretty straightforward.
Yeah, but it's not a perfect solution.
I bet there are some downsides.
Well, for one, it can lead to resistant strains of Pseudomonas.
So the bacteria can actually become immune to the chemicals we're using to kill them.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like an arms race. They evolve to survive.
And I'm guessing it's not a one-time thing. You have to keep applying the chemicals, right?
Exactly. It's an ongoing battle. You have to keep at it. Another method is thermal flushing.
Thermal flushing. So basically using hot water to kill the bacteria.
Basically, yeah. You blast the system with high-temperature water.
Seems logical. Heat usually kills bacteria.
It does, but it's not always practical. Maintaining those high temperatures throughout an entire water system can be tough, especially in large buildings with complex plumbing.
Right. It's not like you can just crank up the hot water heater and call it a day.
Nope. And as soon as the water cools down, the bacteria can start growing again.
So it's a temporary fix, not a permanent solution. What about filtration? Isn't that an option?
Point-of-use filtration is something Chris talks about in his guide. It involves putting filters at the tap to remove the bacteria.
So you're essentially catching the bacteria before it gets into the water you're using?
Exactly. But there are a few drawbacks with that, too.
There always seems to be a catch.
The filters need to be replaced regularly, which can be a hassle. And if they aren't maintained properly, they can actually become a source of contamination themselves.
So instead of removing bacteria, they could actually be breeding it.
It's possible if you're not careful.
Yeah.
It kind of defeats the purpose, right?
It does. It seems like these traditional methods, while somewhat effective, they all have their limitations. What does Chris propose as a more, innovative solution?
Chris talks about something called a silver-copper barrier.
Silver-copper barrier. I'm intrigued. What is that?
It's a device, actually, called the Sentinel Tap Diffuser. It's designed to stop Pseudomonas.
The Sentinel tap diffuser.
Okay.
But silver and copper, how does that work against bacteria?
Well, both silver and copper have antimicrobial properties. Silver ions disrupt the bacteria's cell membranes, proteins, their DNA, essentially shutting them down.
Wow. So it's not just killing them, it's like dismantling them from the inside out.
Exactly. And then copper does the same thing. Plus, it generates these reactive oxygen species. They are lethal to bacteria.
So it's a double whammy. Silver disrupts and copper destroys.
Pretty much.
Yep.
And the best part is it works on both free-floating bacteria and those biofilms. Remember those?
Those tough little bacterial fortresses, how could I forget? This sounds almost too good to be true. Is there actual evidence that it works?
Chris highlights research that shows the Sentinel tap diffuser can reduce bacterial counts by 90%. There's also evidence that it can prevent biofilms from forming and can even kill bacteria that are already part of existing biofilms.
90%. That's incredible. It sounds like this isn't just some marketing gimmick. There's real science behind it.
Absolutely. But technology is just one piece of the puzzle.
Right, it's not a magic bullet. So, what else can we do to prevent Pseudomonas contamination? What does Chris suggest in terms of best practices?
He stresses the importance of establishing good practices at hand wash stations.
Hand wash stations makes sense. That's where a lot of the action happens, right?
Exactly. For example, keeping hand washing stations strictly for hand washing. No cleaning supplies or equipment should be washed there.
Okay, so keep it dedicated to hand washing only. That makes sense to me.
Another thing is proper disposal of body fluids. They shouldn't go into the hand wash basin. There are designated areas for that.
Right, so again, keeping things separate and organized. What about cleaning medical equipment? Where does that happen?
That shouldn't happen in hand wash basins either. There should be designated sinks for that.
So hand washing stations are strictly for hands. Got it. What about ensuring that people are actually using those hand wash stations regularly?
Absolutely, that's important too. It helps prevent water from sitting in the pipes for too long, which can encourage bacterial growth.
Keep things flowing. I like it. Anything specific about high-risk areas like, say, a neonatal ward?
Yeah, in those situations, you want to make sure you're using water that's been thoroughly tested and is safe for those vulnerable patients.
Of course, you don't want to take any chances with the little ones. What else should we keep in mind?
Regularly flushing the taps, particularly in those high-risk areas. And if you notice anything that seems off, report it right away.
Don't wait for it to become a bigger problem. Be proactive.
Exactly. And think about those alcohol gel dispensers you see everywhere. They shouldn't be placed right next to the sinks.
Oh, interesting. Why not?
It's all about minimizing the risk of cross-contamination. If someone uses the sink and then touches the dispenser, they could transfer bacteria.
I never thought about that before, but it makes perfect sense. Speaking of those dispensers, what's the best way to manage them?
Chris recommends using single-use, pre-filled bottles. No refilling or topping them up, as that can introduce bacteria.
So every step of the process matters. It sounds like there are so many things we can do to minimize the risk of contamination.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned some compliance guidelines earlier. Can you tell me more about those?
Sure. Chris refers to guidelines like HTM 0401, L8, BS 8580, BS 8680. They basically set the standards for water, quality, and safety, especially in healthcare settings.
Okay, so it's not just about one device or practice, it's about a whole system approach.
Exactly. It's a multi-pronged defense against Pseudomonas.
I like that analogy. It really emphasizes the need for a layered approach. But what if, despite all our best efforts, Pseudomonas still manages to sneak in? Where else might it be hiding?
That's a great question. And that's what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive. We'll take a look at the bigger picture of Pseudomonas prevention.
I'm ready to keep diving.
That's true. Pseudomonas is sneaky. It's not just hanging out in taps and basins. It can be anywhere there's moisture in a water system.
So, like, in the pipes themselves?
Oh, yeah. Shower heads, storage tanks.
Oh gosh, even in like the tubing of medical devices.
Exactly. That's why we need to think about the entire system. It's not just about those individual points.
Right, the Sentinel tap diffuser is great, but it only protects specific areas. What about those other parts of the system?
Well, that's where regular maintenance comes in. It's key.
Maintenance. Okay, like what kind of things are we talking about?
Flushing the system out regularly, making sure storage tanks are cleaned properly, replacing filters on schedule. It's all about preventative care.
Like preventative care for your plumbing.
Yeah, exactly. It's much easier to prevent these problems than to try to fix them after they happen.
Prevention is always better than cure, right? Anything else we can do?
Monitoring water quality is really important too.
Okay, so regularly testing the water for any signs of contamination.
Exactly. It's like having a security system. You're constantly watching for any signs of trouble.
I like that, a security system for your water. So what happens if we do find something?
Well, the sooner you catch it, the better. You can take action right away.
So like contain the problem, flush it out, that kind of thing.
Yep. And then implement stricter monitoring. That's where those compliance guidelines we talked about earlier really come in handy.
Okay, so those guidelines provide a framework for responding to those situations.
Right. And they help ensure that you're responding effectively and safely.
Makes sense. Preparation is key. But Beyond reacting to contamination, is there anything we can do to make our water systems inherently more resistant to Pseudomonas in the first place?
That's a great question. You're thinking like a designer.
Well, I do like to think ahead.
One thing is using materials that are less prone to biofilm formation.
Oh, so choosing pipes and fixtures that are naturally more resistant to those bacterial colonies.
Exactly. And designing the system so there are fewer dead ends where water can just sit there and stagnate.
Right, so good water flow and temperature control are important.
Absolutely. It's all about creating an environment that's not very welcoming to Pseudomonas.
Making it as inhospitable as possible.
Exactly. Think of it like building a fortress.
Okay, a fortress. But even the best fortress needs people to defend it.
Exactly. That's why communication and collaboration are so important.
So everyone involved, from the people who design the system to the people who use it, needs to be aware of the risks and how to prevent them.
Precisely. It's a team effort.
A shared responsibility for keeping our water safe. But we can't forget that this field is constantly evolving. What other new innovations are out there that could help us fight Pseudomonas even better?
There are some exciting developments. Ultraviolet light disinfection is one.
UV light, like those little wands people use to clean their phones.
Similar concept, but in this case you're using it to disinfect the water on a larger scale.
So integrating UV systems into the pipes themselves.
Yep, it's still in development, but it has a lot of potential.
That sounds very futuristic. Anything else on the horizon?
Nanotechnology is another area researchers are exploring.
Nanotechnology, wow. Okay, tell me more.
So imagine nanoparticles with antimicrobial properties that you can embed in pipes or coatings.
So surfaces that can actually repel bacteria on their own.
Exactly. Self-cleaning surfaces, that's the goal.
That would be amazing. It sounds like there are lots of exciting possibilities for the future of Pseudomonas prevention.
There are. It's an ongoing battle. But we're learning more and developing new strategies all the time.
So we're not defenseless against this threat.
Nope. By staying informed, following those best practices, and supporting research, we can create safer environments.
Knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely. And while we've been focused on healthcare settings, it's important to remember that Pseudomonas can be a concern in our everyday lives too.
That's a good point. So let's shift gears now and talk about what this means for everyone, not just people in hospitals. So we've talked a lot about Pseudomonas in hospitals and clinics, but this isn't just a healthcare problem, right?
Right. It's important to remember that Pseudomonas is all around us. It's in water, soil, even on plants.
It's everywhere, so even if we're not in a hospital, we could still be exposed.
Yes, but for most healthy people, it's not a big deal. Our immune systems can usually handle it.
Okay, that's good to know. But you're saying there are some people who need to be more careful.
Yeah, people with weaker immune systems, like young children or older adults.
So what can those people do to protect themselves?
Well, being aware of your water quality is a good start.
Okay, so making sure the water we're drinking and using is clean.
Exactly. And don't forget about your home plumbing. Regular cleaning and maintenance can make a big difference.
Right, so those little things we often overlook.
And of course, good hygiene is always important.
Hand washing. We can't forget about hand washing.
Exactly. It's one of the simplest yet most effective ways to prevent the spread of germs.
It's not about being afraid of everything, but just being smart and taking precautions.
I agree. It's about being informed and making good choices.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've learned about what Pseudomonas is, how it spreads, and the different ways to prevent it.
We've talked about traditional methods, new technologies, and the importance of a comprehensive approach.
A lot to think about. So what's the biggest takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing is to remember that preventing Pseudomonas isn't about one single solution.
Right, it's not a one and done kind of thing.
Exactly. It takes a multi-pronged approach. We need a combination of different methods and best practices to be truly effective.
It's like building a strong defense with multiple layers of protection.
Exactly. And we need to be proactive. We need to be constantly monitoring, evaluating, and adapting our approach.
So it's an ongoing process.
It is. We're always learning and finding new ways to stay ahead of this threat.
It's reassuring to know that people are out there working on this.
And remember, if you're ever unsure about something, there are experts you can reach out to.
People who can provide guidance and support. That's good to know. Well, that brings our deep dive into Pseudomonas prevention to a close.
It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thanks for all the insights. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us. We hope you learned something new today.
Stay curious and stay informed.
And don't forget to wash your hands. Until next time.